sky over this dead land no longer remembers rain. Dust clings thick across the leaning wooden house and its cracked floorboards that run like veins on old hands. On the porch, a man sits silent by the dry well. His hand stays near the rifle, but his fingers do not grasp it. 91 days without rain have passed. The horse in the corral sways on weak legs, ribs showing clear under thin hide. Then on the horizon where heat bends the air, two shapes appear. They do not charge like foes, they stagger, one supporting the other. The smaller one folds to the ground as if strings were cut. The taller kneels beside her, both hands pressed to her face, as though holding herself together. Dry wind carries the scrape of rope on stone from the well. No gunshot breaks the quiet. Only thick silence fills the space. On the collapsed figure's leg, a small wound glows deep purple, spreading like a warning. The man stands. He runs toward them. The land had stopped giving. Silas Whitfield knew the exact day it happened. 91 days without rain. He'd stopped counting after that. Because counting meant hoping. And hoping, out here, was just another way to starve slower. He stood on the porch of a house that used to hold laughter. Now it held dust. Cracks ran through the floorboards like veins on an old man's hands. The barn leaned sideways, tired of standing. Everything tired. Everything leaning toward the ground, waiting for permission to fall. In the corral, his horse struggled to stay upright. Ranger, 9 years old. Once the finest animal in 3 counties. Now just ribs and hide and breath that rattled like loose gravel in a tin cup. Silas watched him sway. Watched him catch himself. Watched him fail to catch himself the second time. Not yet, Silas said. Quiet. Like a prayer he didn't believe would be answered. Not yet, old friend. The horse didn't answer. Horses rarely do, behind Silas. Inside the house, a chair sat empty at the table. Had sat empty for 2 years. He never moved it, couldn't. Moving it meant admitting the table only needed one place setting now. And some mornings admitting that felt harder than the drought. Harder than the debt. Harder than anything the land could throw at him. Eleanor used to sit there. Eleanor, who hummed while she worked. Eleanor, who once told him a man's worth wasn't in what he owned, but in what he was willing to give away. He'd laughed at her for that. Told her it was easy to say when you had plenty to give. She'd just smiled. The kind of smile that knew something he didn't. 2 years gone. Fever took her in November. Took their daughter 3 weeks after, 6 years old. Gone before she understood what gone meant. Since then, Silas talked to the horse more than he talked to people. Since then, God had gone quiet on him. Or maybe he'd gone quiet on God. Hard to say which came first anymore. He walked to the well, cranked the handle, waited. Nothing, just the sound of rope scraping against dry stone. Just the echo of a bucket hitting bottom with no water to catch it. He sat down right there in the dirt. Didn't plan to. His knees just gave the order and his body obeyed. Because what was left to stand for? The house was failing. The horse was dying. The wife was gone. The daughter was gone. And somewhere in the last 2 years, Silas Whitfield had gone a little bit gone too. Not dead, not quite. Just absent. A man wearing his own boots, walking his own land, answering to his own name. And still somehow missing from all of it. He almost didn't see them. That's the part he'd think about later. Almost didn't look up. Almost let the moment pass him by the way he let most moments pass him by now. But something moved on the horizon. A shimmer. Heat playing tricks, probably. The desert did that. Showed you rivers that weren't there. Showed you people who weren't there. Except this one didn't disappear when he blinked. He stood, shielded his eyes, squinted hard against the white glare of afternoon. 2 shapes, staggering. Not walking, staggering, the way exhaustion makes a person walk when the body has stopped asking permission from the mind. He watched them get closer, watched the taller one, hold up the smaller one, watched the smaller one's legs buckle, and the taller one refused to let her fall. His first thought, and he hated himself for it later, was Apache. His second thought was the word everyone around here used. The word soaked into every conversation at the trading post, Every warning from every neighbor, every story told around, every fire. For the last 10 years. Enemy. His hand drifted toward the rifle, leaning against the porch rail, because that's what you did. That's what a man did out here. You protected what was yours. Even when what was yours was almost nothing, except the smaller one collapsed. Right there, 30 yards out. Just folded to the ground like her strings had been cut, and the taller one didn't run. Didn't reach for a weapon. Didn't do anything but drop to her knees beside her sister and press both hands against her own face like she was trying to hold herself together. With her palms, Silas stood there. Rifle 6 inches from his hand. Heart doing something complicated in his chest, which is when he noticed his hand had stopped moving toward the gun. Had, somewhere in the last 4 seconds, changed its mind entirely. Because that wasn't the posture of an enemy. That was the posture of someone who had nothing left to fight with. He walked toward them, slow at first, then faster. Then he was running. Boots kicking up dust that hadn't held a footprint in weeks. The older one looked up when he got close. Her eyes, he'd remember this for the rest of his life, her eyes weren't afraid of him exactly. They were afraid of everything, him included, but mostly just afraid, the way a person gets when fear has been sitting in their chest, so long it stops being an emotion and becomes a permanent resident. She said something. Not English. Fast, urgent, the words tumbling over each other. He didn't understand a single one. Didn't need to. Her hands were doing the talking, pointing at her sister, at the wound on her sister's leg, at the sky, like she was asking it for something it hadn't agreed to give. Okay, Silas said. Hands up. Slow. The way you'd approach a spooked animal. Okay. I've got you. I've got you both. The words probably meant nothing to her. But his tone must have carried something across the language, because she stopped talking, stopped fighting him. When he reached for her sister, he lifted the younger one into his arms. Couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds soaking wet, and she was burning. Burning like a stove left on too long. Her skin practically hummed with fever. The older sister walked beside him the whole way to the house. Close. Too close for a stranger, but he understood it wasn't about him. It was about not letting her sister out of arm's reach. Not for one more second than absolutely necessary. He kicked the door open, laid the girl down on the floor because there wasn't a bed built for guests. Hadn't needed one in 2 years. The older one dropped beside her sister immediately, pressed a hand to her forehead, said something low. A name, maybe. Repeated twice, like a question that needed answering. Silas knelt on the other side, looked at the wound, and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the heat outside. Because it wasn't just infected, the skin around it had gone the wrong color. A deep, bruised purple radiating out from a puncture no wider than a fingertip. Too clean an entry point for a cactus thorn. Too deliberate. He'd seen wounds like this before, once. A ranch hand, years back. Caught the edge of an arrow meant for something else entirely. This wasn't an accident. Someone had shot this girl. He looked up at the older sister. She was watching his face, watching it change. And something in her expression told him she already knew what he'd just figured out. Had known since it happened, had been carrying that knowledge across miles of open desert with nowhere to set it down. Who did this? He said. Not really a question. More just words falling out of the shock. She didn't understand him, couldn't have. But she understood the shape of the question, shook her head once. Sharp. A refusal to answer, or maybe a refusal to believe it herself. He didn't push. Not then. There'd be time for that later, maybe. If there was a later. Right now there was only the fever, only the wound, only a girl who might not see morning if he didn't do something. He didn't have medicine. Hadn't had real medicine in a year. Couldn't afford the trip to town. Couldn't afford much of anything. What he had was whiskey, clean cloth, and a knowledge passed down from a mother who'd doctored half the county before consumption took her. This is gonna hurt, he told the girl, even though she couldn't understand, even though her eyes were barely open. Some things you say anyway, not for their sake, for yours. So you remember you're not a monster for what you're about to do. He cleaned the wound with whiskey. She screamed, a raw, broken sound that didn't need translating. The older sister grabbed her hand, held it so hard her knuckles went white. And through it all, she never once looked away from her sister's face, not a flicker. Not a blink toward the door, toward the window, toward escape. Silas worked through the pain, through the screaming, through his own hands, shaking with a fear he didn't examine too closely. Worked until the wound was clean. Until he'd packed it, wrapped it, done everything his mother had ever taught him, and then some things he made up on the spot, because desperation teaches a man tricks his mother never had time for. By the time he finished, the sun had gone down. He hadn't noticed it leaving. The girl slept. Fitful, fever-soaked, but breathing. The older sister sat against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on her sister's rising and falling ribs like she was counting every single breath, making sure there was a next one. Silas sat across the room, watched her, watch her sister, didn't say anything, because what was there to say? Horse passed like that. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind picked up, the dry, useless wind that promised rain and delivered nothing but more dust. Around midnight, he made a decision that surprised him more than it should have. He got up, walked to the small chest in the corner, the one he hadn't opened since November, Eleanor's things. He hadn't touched them, couldn't. Every time he came close, his hands just stopped, like his body knew something his mind wasn't ready to admit. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't fully name, he opened it, found what he was looking for near the top, a small clay jar. Herbs Eleanor used to keep for fevers, willow bark mostly, and something else she'd learned from a midwife 2 towns over. She used to say, every home should have medicine a doctor doesn't need to be called for. He'd thought it was just talk. Turned out she'd been preparing for exactly this kind of night years before it arrived. He crushed the bark, boiled water he barely had to spare, made a bitter tea, and, kneeling beside the girl, lifted her head just enough to get it past her lips. She swallowed, coughed, swallowed again. The older sister watched every movement, every single one. And when Silas set the girl's head back down gently, something shifted in her face. Not trust exactly, too soon for trust, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized effort when it saw it. "Thank you," she said. In English clear, careful, like she'd been holding those 2 words in reserve, testing them silently before she trusted her own mouth with them. Silas looked up, startled. "You speak English, a little," she said. "My sister more. She learns fast. Faster than me. What's your name?" A pause. Long enough that he thought maybe that was the limit of her English after all. "A pony," she finally said. "A pony," he repeated, careful, with it like handling something breakable. "I'm Silas," she nodded. "Didn't offer anything more. And your sister?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "Winona." He looked down at the girl. Winona, 19 maybe. Younger than he'd first guessed. Now that the firelight showed her face without the mask of fever flush and desert dust. "Winona," he said softly, like testing whether the name might wake her. It didn't. But somewhere in her sleep, her hand twitched toward the sound of it. A pony watched that too. Watched everything. He was starting to understand that about her. She missed nothing. Fear had trained her eyes to catalog every detail in a room within seconds. An animal that survives by noticing. "Why?" Silas asked. Simple word. Everything he wanted to know folded inside it. A pony's jaw tightened. "Not now," she said. Someone shot her. Not now. He let it go. For tonight. Because pushing a half-starved, terrified young woman for answers at midnight, in a stranger's house, after the worst day of her life, that wasn't the kind of man he wanted to be. Even if some hard, suspicious part of him wanted answers immediately. Wanted to know exactly what kind of danger he'd just carried through his front door. He banked the fire, fetched every blanket the house had, which wasn't many, but it was more than the 2 of them currently had, which was none. laid them out near the hearth. "Sleep," he told Apache. "I'll watch her." She looked at him like he'd suggested something impossible. "You sleep," he said again, softer. "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't move, didn't blink, just studied him the way you'd study a locked door, trying to determine if it was actually locked or just appeared that way. Eventually, and he never did figure out what tipped the decision, she lay down, not far from her sister, close enough to touch her if she reached out in the dark. She didn't fall asleep quickly. He could tell by her breathing, still too controlled, too even. The breathing of someone forcing calm rather than feeling it. But eventually, sometime past 2 in the morning, her body gave up the fight and exhaustion won. Silas sat awake in the dark, alone with his thoughts, which, these days, wasn't company he particularly enjoyed. He looked at Winona's face in the dying firelight, looked at the sweat beading on her forehead, reached over, without quite deciding to, and pressed a damp cloth against her skin. She stirred, murmured something in a language he didn't know. Then, unexpectedly, in broken English, "Sister." "Where?" "Sister, right here," Silas whispered. "She's right here, sleeping. You're safe." He didn't know if that last word was true. Didn't know anything about their story yet. Who'd shot her? Who was hunting them? What kind of trouble had followed 2 Apache sisters across 50 miles of open desert to his dying doorstep? But he said it anyway, because sometimes a lie is just a promise you haven't made true yet. The night stretched on. Silas kept vigil the way he used to keep vigil over his daughter during her worst fever nights. Cloth to forehead, water past cracked lips, whispered words that meant nothing except "I am here. I am here. I am here." By the time gray light started creeping through the window, Winona's fever had broken. He felt it before he saw it. The change in her skin, the way the heat radiating off her, had shifted from furnace to something almost normal. He pressed his hand to her forehead and nearly wept with the relief of it. She opened her eyes. Dark eyes. Clear, for the first time since she'd arrived. She looked at him, really looked, seeing him for the first time. Rather than through the haze of fever, she didn't scream, didn't flinch. She just studied his face the way her sister had studied it hours before. Cataloging. Deciding. "You saved me," she said. English. Rougher than her sister's, but understandable. "Your body did most of it," Silas said. "I just kept you company." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Faint, but real company," she repeated, like she liked the taste of the word. "Sister said, 'You are kind, man. Your sister barely spoke to me. She watches.'" Winona said, "She decides fast. Faster than she talks." A pony stirred at the sound of voices. Sat up so quickly it looked like she'd never actually been asleep, just performing sleep while some part of her stayed on guard. Her eyes went straight to her sister. To the open, clear, fever-free eyes looking back at her. Something broke in her face. Not the wound crack of grief. The other kind. The kind that happens when relief arrives. So suddenly the body doesn't know how to hold it. She crossed the room on her knees. Pulled her sister into her arms. Said something in Apache, fast, tumbling, half laughing, half crying. The kind of sentence that isn't really meant for anyone else to understand because it isn't really a sentence, it's just relief given sound. Silas looked away. Gave them the moment. Because some things a stranger shouldn't watch too closely, even a stranger who just spent all night keeping the moment possible. 3 days passed. Silas would later think of them as the strangest 3 days of his life. And considering everything that came after, that was saying something. Winona grew stronger by the hour. By the second day, she could sit up on her own. By the third, she was insisting, over a pony's sharp objections, on helping with small chores around the house. Sweeping. Fetching what little water the well still gave up. She should rest, Silas told a pony, watching Winona stubbornly drag a broom across the floor, despite her bandaged leg. "Tell her that," a pony said. Flat. "She listens to no one. Not even our father." "Your father," Silas said, careful, testing the door to see if it was still locked. A pony's face closed instantly. "Not now," she said again. Her answer to everything, apparently, when the question got too close to the truth. He let it go. Again. But he noticed things. Small things. The way a pony flinched at the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, even when it was only wild mustangs crossing the far ridge. The way she slept, with one eye seemingly always half open. The way she kept glancing toward the horizon like she was counting down to something. Running from her father, he'd assumed at first. The way the story usually went, in every tale he'd ever heard about runaway daughters and arranged marriages. But something about that explanation didn't sit right. A pony didn't carry herself like a woman fleeing an unwanted wedding. She carried herself like a soldier, like someone bracing for battle, not avoiding one. On the second night, over a thin stew made from the last of his dried beans, Winona finally started talking, more than her sister ever had. "You lost someone," she said. Not a question. Silas nearly dropped his spoon. "How do you know?" Winona shrugged. Simple gesture. Complicated meaning. Your eyes. Same as mine. When I lost, she stopped, glanced at a pony. Some unspoken agreement passed between the sisters, a decision about how much truth to hand a stranger. "Our mother," Winona finished. "3 winters ago. I'm sorry," Silas said. And meant it, in the particular way only someone who has lost someone truly means those words. "You too," Winona said. Gentle. "Someone. I see it. In the chair." Silas followed her gaze to the empty chair at the table. "The one he never moved, my wife," he said. Quiet. The word still cost him something every time he used it. "And my daughter." Fever. 2 years back. A pony looked up at that. First time she'd looked directly at him without suspicion coloring the expression. "A daughter," she said. "How old?" 6. Something passed over a pony's face. Fast. Gone before he could read it fully. But it looked, for just a moment, like recognition. Like the number 6 meant something to her beyond simple sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said. And unlike her usual clipped answers, this one carried weight. Carried something that sounded almost like it came from personal understanding, not polite obligation. Silas wanted to ask what she meant by that look. Wanted to ask 100 things. Who shot Winona? What they were running from? Why a pony flinched at every sound? Why the number 6 had seemed to land on her like a stone dropped into still water. But he didn't. Some instinct told him the answers would come when they were ready. Not before. Instead, he reached for the small tin box he kept on the mantel. Opened it. Inside sat one of the few things he'd kept from Eleanor's jewelry. A beaded bracelet, simple, worn from years of use. She'd worn it every day of their marriage. He'd never been able to explain why he kept it in the tin instead of the chest with everything else. Some things you keep close without knowing why. He didn't offer it to anyone. Didn't even take it out fully, just opened the box, glanced at it the way he did most nights, a small private ritual of grief. But a pony saw it. From across the room, her eyes caught on the bracelet before he closed the lid, and her whole body went still. "Where did you get that?" she said. Voice different now, sharper. Urgent in a way it hadn't been even when discussing her own sister's wound. Silas blinked, caught off guard. "It was my wife's." "Why?" A pony's mouth opened, closed. Opened again like she was searching for words in a language that had suddenly abandoned her. The pattern, she finally said. "The beads." Where did she? She stopped herself. Shook her head. "It's nothing. It looks like nothing. I'm tired," but it wasn't nothing. Silas could see that clearly. Whatever she'd almost said, she'd swallowed it back down at the last second. The way you swallow a scream in a place where screaming isn't safe. "A pony," he said, gentle. "What is it?" "Nothing," she repeated, firmer this time. A door closing, deliberately, and locking behind it. "I should sleep." She stood. Walked to the corner where the blankets waited. Lay down with her back to the room, to him, to whatever question had just cracked something open in her before she'd forced it shut again. Silas looked down at the bracelet in his hand. Simple beadwork. Faded blue and white, a pattern Eleanor once told him her own grandmother had taught her. Passed down through some family connection he'd never asked enough questions about, while she was alive to answer them. He closed the tin, set it back on the mantel. But he didn't stop wondering. didn't stop turning the moment over in his mind long after the fire burned down to embers, because something about the way a pony looked at that bracelet wasn't recognition of a pattern. It was recognition of a person. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Silas woke before dawn, the way he always did now, habit outliving purpose. He stepped onto the porch expecting the same gray, hopeless horizon he'd watched every morning for 3 months. Instead, he found Winona already awake, sitting on the porch steps, watching the desert like it might answer a question she hadn't asked out loud yet. "You should be resting," he said. "I rest enough," she said. "Enough to think." "About what?" She looked up at him. In 3 days, something had shifted in her eyes. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had settled into something calmer. Determination, maybe. Or resignation. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. "We cannot stay," she said. "You're not strong enough to travel. Stronger every day. Because of you." A pause. "But staying makes you a target. If they find us here." "Who's they, Winona?" She hesitated. Looked toward the house where a pony still slept, then back at Silas. "My sister will be angry, I tell you," she said. "But you saved my life. You should know what you saved it from." Silas sat down beside her on the step. Waited. "We did not run from marriage," Winona said, voice dropping, like even out here, in the open desert, walls might be listening. "That is what people would guess. That is what your stories about our people always say. A girl runs from a husband she does not want." She shook her head. "This is not that story." "Then what story is it?" "We were accused," Winona said, "of stealing something sacred. A relic kept by our people for generations, something that should never leave the hands it belongs to. Did you take it?" "No." Fierce, immediate, no hesitation at all. "Never, but someone made it look that way. Someone who wanted us blamed." "Who?" Winona's jaw tightened. "A man named Nokosi, a warrior. He wanted to marry my sister." She said no. He did not accept the answer as final. She looked down at her bandaged leg. "When we ran, not from marriage, from the accusation, from what would happen to us if our own people believed the lie. He followed. Found us 3 days into the desert. And he did that." Silas nodded toward her leg. "He said it was a warning. Said if we returned and confessed, the poison had an antidote. Said if we kept running." She didn't finish. Didn't need to. Silas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Not since the day the doctor told him there was nothing more to be done for Eleanor. Anger, real anger. The kind that gives a man purpose he thought he'd lost for good. "He's still out there," Silas said. "Not a question. Looking for us." "Yes." Winona met his eyes. "And Silas. He is not the only danger. If my father's people find us before the truth is known, they may believe what Nokosi told them. They may not ask questions before deciding what we deserve. Your own father would. My father loves us." Winona said quickly. "But my father also leads. And leaders sometimes have to choose between love and law, even when it breaks something inside them to do it." She looked away. "We do not know what Nokosi has told him. We do not know what my father believes right now, in this moment, while we sit on your porch and pretend we are safe." Silas sat with that, with the full weight of what he'd unknowingly stepped into. Not a simple act of charity toward 2 lost travelers. A man hunting them with poison. A tribal leader who might already believe them guilty of a crime that could mean their deaths. And somewhere behind all of it, a mystery bracelet that had turned a pony's face pale with something that looked disturbingly like memory. "You should have told me sooner," he said. Not accusing, just tired. The particular tiredness of a man who keeps discovering the ground beneath him is less solid than he thought. "Would you still have helped us?" Winona asked. "Knowing all this. Knowing the danger you invite onto your land." Silas thought about Ranger, dying slow, in the corral. Thought about the empty chair at his table. Thought about a wife who used to say a man's worth lives in what he's willing to give away. "Yes," he said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it completely. Winona studied him for a long moment, then nodded, like he'd passed some test she hadn't announced she was giving. Then we have a problem, she said. Because staying endangers you, and leaving before I am strong enough endangers me, and my sister will not leave without me. So we are stuck, all three of us. In the same trap, Silas looked out at the horizon, at the flat, merciless stretch of desert that had delivered these two women to his door and might at any moment deliver something far worse behind them. We'll figure it out, he said, behind them. The door creaked open. A pony stood in the frame, hair loose from sleep, eyes already sharp with suspicion. Figure what out, she said. Her gaze moved from Silas to her sister and back again, quick, assessing, already guessing at the shape of the conversation she'd walked into. She told me, Winona said simply. No apology in her voice. A pony's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further. You had no right. He saved my life, a pony. He deserves to know what he's risking by doing it again. The sisters stared at each other. A conversation happening entirely in silence, the kind only siblings can have, years of shared history compressed into a single locked gaze. Finally, a pony looked away first, looked at Silas instead. Now you know, she said, flat, guarded. Now you understand why we cannot stay long. Why every day here is a day closer to bringing ruin to your door. I understand, Silas said. Then you understand you should let us leave. Today. Now even. Your sister can barely walk a mile. Better a mile away from you than 100 yards from a man hunting us. A pony. Winona's voice, soft but firm. He is trying to help. Help gets people killed, a pony snapped. Then, immediately, looked like she regretted the sharpness of it. Looked, for just a second, impossibly young and impossibly tired. I have watched help get people killed. Nobody spoke for a moment. The wind picked up, dragging dust across the yard, rattling the loose boards of the barn. I'm not asking you to trust me, Silas finally said. I'm asking you to let your sister heal. 2 more days. 3, maybe. Then we figure out what come next. Together if you'll let it be together. A pony's arms crossed tighter over her chest. A wall built out of exhaustion and fear, and underneath both of those, something that looked almost like the beginning of hope, the kind of hope a person resents feeling, because hope has betrayed them before. 2 days, she finally said. No more. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was a door left open half an inch, instead of slammed shut. Silas would take it. That afternoon, while Winona rested and a pony sat watch on the porch like a sentry who'd never learned how to stop being one, Silas walked out to the corral. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of approaching boots. Weak, but present. Still fighting. Been a strange few days. Huh, Silas said, running a hand along the horse's neck. Strangest since your mother left this world, probably. Ranger huffed. Silas liked to think it was agreement. There's a man out there, Silas continued, voice low. The way a man talks to an animal when he needs to hear the shape of his own thoughts out loud. Hunting 2 women who never did him wrong. And somewhere behind all this, there's a tribe that might already believe the worst about people who deserve better. He shook his head. And somehow, old friend, we're standing right in the middle of it. He looked toward the house. Toward a pony's silhouette on the porch, still as a carved figure, eyes fixed on the horizon like she could will danger into staying away just by watching hard enough for it. And he thought about Eleanor's bracelet. About the way a pony's face had gone pale and urgent at the sight of it. About a question, half asked and immediately swallowed. Something connected those 2 women to his past in a way he didn't understand yet. Some thread reaching backward through time, tangled up in beadwork, and a look he couldn't shake from his memory. He didn't know what it meant. But some instinct, the same instinct that had stopped his hand from reaching for the rifle 4 days ago, told him it mattered. Told him this wasn't coincidence, dressed up as circumstance. Told him the desert hadn't just delivered 2 strangers to his door. It had delivered a debt he didn't yet know he owed. He went back inside as the light started to fade. Found a pony still on the porch, unmoving, like the wood had grown up around her. You should eat something, he said. Not hungry. You haven't eaten since morning, I said. Not hungry. Sharp. Then, a beat later, softer. I don't have room for hunger. Fear takes up the space. He sat down beside her. Not too close. Left a careful gap, the kind a man leaves when he's learned that closeness has to be earned in small increments, not claimed all at once. Tell me about your father, he said. Why? Because you flinch every time I mention him. And I'd like to understand why. She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer at all. My father is a good man, she finally said. Which is the problem? How is that a problem? Because good men still make mistakes when they are frightened. And a man who leads people, who is responsible for all of them, not just his own daughters, he cannot always choose his heart over his duty. She looked out at the darkening sky. I have seen him do hard things before, necessary things. I have watched him carry the weight of choices that broke something in him every time. You think he'd choose the tribe over you, I think, Apache said slowly. That Nkosi is clever enough to make it look like there is no other choice. Silas turned that over. What was the relic? He asked. The one you're accused of stealing. Something flickered across her face. Old grief, maybe, or old caution. A bundle, she said. Sacred, kept by my mother's family for 3 generations before it was entrusted to our village. It disappeared the same week. Nkosi asked for my hand and I refused him. She let that sit, let him draw the obvious conclusion without her having to state it outright. He accused us within a day. Said he saw us near the sacred lodge that night. Said he found threads from my dress caught on the doorframe. Did you go near the lodge? No, no hesitation. I have never entered that lodge in my life. Only the keepers may enter. Everyone knows this. Then why would anyone believe him? Apache's laugh was short, humorless. Because fear does not need truth. It only needs a story simple enough to repeat. And Nkosi tells simple stories very well. Silas looked at her profile in the fading light. Saw for the first time, not just fear in her, but something that looked almost like exhaustion of a different kind. The exhaustion of being disbelieved before you've even had the chance to speak. I believe you, he said. Apache turned to look at him. Really, look. The way she hadn't quite managed since the day she'd arrived. You don't know me, she said. You have no reason to believe anything I say. I've got a reason, Silas said. I watched you hold your sister's hand through a night I wasn't sure she'd survive. I watched you refuse to sleep until you knew she was breathing steady. Liars don't sit vigil like that. Liars sleep just fine. Something in Apache's face cracked. Just slightly. Just enough that for one unguarded second, he saw straight through the wall she'd built and found something raw and frightened and grateful underneath it, all tangled together. She looked away before he could see more. Thank you, she said, quiet, the words costing her something, the way Winona's had cost her something that first night. For what? For believing a stranger over the story your own people would tell you. Silas thought about that a moment. Thought about the trading post gossip, the fireside warnings, the word enemy that had lived in his mouth for years without him ever questioning it. Funny thing about stories, he said. The ones you're handed secondhand start looking a lot thinner once you meet the person they're supposed to be about. Apache didn't answer that. But she didn't move away either. And for the first time since she'd arrived, the silence between them didn't feel like a locked door. It felt, instead, like the pause right before someone decides to open one. The next morning brought trouble of a different kind. Silas heard the wagon before he saw it, the particular rattle of a buckboard driven too fast over uneven ground. He stepped off the porch just as it crested the rise, Walter Higgins at the reins, his youngest boy beside him, both of them squinting toward the house like they already suspected what they'd find. Walter, Silas called, keeping his voice easy, neighborly. The way you'd greet a man on any ordinary day. Even though nothing about this day was ordinary, Walter didn't return the greeting. Just pulled the wagon to a stop and stared past Silas toward the house, toward the door where, Silas realized with a drop in his stomach, Winona had just stepped out to see who'd arrived. Heard talk in town, Walter said. Voice flat. Talk about you harboring Indians out here. Talk travels fast for a town 40 miles off. Fast enough when it's the kind of talk that matters. Walter's eyes narrowed. Is it true? Silas thought about lying. Thought about it seriously, for the length of one held breath. Then decided against it. 2 young women, he said, half dead when I found them. I gave them water and a place to heal. That's all. That's all. Walter repeated the words like they tasted wrong in his mouth. Silas, you got any idea what kind of danger you're inviting? Apache don't forget grudges. You help the wrong ones. You paint a target on every homestead within 20 miles. These 2 haven't got a grudge against anybody. They're running from trouble, not causing it. That's what they told you. That's what I believe. Walter shook his head slowly, the particular headshake of a man who thinks he's watching a friend make a fatal mistake and doesn't know how to stop it. You always were soft since Eleanor passed. Don't take that as an insult. Take it as a warning. Soft men get taken advantage of. Soft men get their throats cut in their sleep because they were too kind to ask the hard questions first. I've asked the hard questions? Then you know what everyone in town already suspects. That you're keeping 2 fugitives who ran from their own people for a reason. Could be murder. Could be theft. Could be 100 things worse than whatever pretty story they fed you. Behind Silas. He heard the door creak. Turned to see a pony standing in the frame now too, beside her sister, both of them still and silent, watching the exchange with expressions carved from stone. They understood enough English to follow most of it. Understood exactly what was being said about them, and by whom, and why. They're not fugitives, Silas said, low and hard. They're being hunted by a liar who wants a wife he can't have, honestly. You believe that because they told you to believe it. I believe it because I've got eyes, Walter. I've watched them for 4 days. I know the difference between guilt and grief. These 2 are carrying grief, not guilt. Walter's jaw worked, chewing on something he clearly wanted to say and wasn't sure would land right. Finally, he just shook his head again. Town's talking, he said. Talking ugly. You keep this up. You're not just risking your own neck, Silas. You're risking every family between here and the river. People are scared. Scared people do foolish things. Then maybe somebody ought to remind them. Fear isn't the same as facts. Walter stared at him a long moment. Something almost like sympathy crossed his weathered face, buried under the suspicion. I knew Eleanor, he said, quieter now. She'd have done the same thing you're doing. Doesn't mean it's smart. Just means it's exactly the kind of foolish, kind-hearted thing she'd have talked you into. He picked up the reins. Watch your back, Silas. That's all I'm saying. Not everyone out here shares your charity. He turned the wagon and left the way he'd come, dust rising behind the wheels like a warning written in the air. Silas stood watching until the wagon disappeared over the rise, then turned back toward the house, toward 2 sisters who'd heard every word and understood exactly what it meant. He's not wrong, a pony said quietly. About the danger, he's not right either, Silas said. Not about you. It doesn't matter what's right. A pony said. It matters what people believe. That's the lesson I keep learning, over and over. Matter how many times I hope it isn't true, Silas didn't have an answer for that. Because some part of him, the part that had lived out here long enough to understand how fear moved through small, scared communities like fire through dry grass, knew she was right. But another part of him, a part he thought had gone quiet 2 years ago, was already deciding. It didn't matter. He'd made his choice the moment he'd walked toward 2 collapsing strangers instead of reaching for his rifle. He wasn't about to unmake it now. That evening, after Walter's wagon had long since disappeared, and the house had settled back into its uneasy quiet, Silas found Winona sitting alone by the corral fence, watching Ranger the way she'd watched the horizon that first morning. Like the animal held some answer she was still waiting to hear. He's not going to make it, is he? She said, not looking at Silas as he approached. The horse. Been saying that to myself for a month, but you keep feeding him. Keep giving him water you don't have to spare. Man doesn't give up on something just because the odds turned ugly. Winona finally looked at him. Is that why you kept us?
Because giving up on us would have felt the same as giving up on him.
Silas hadn't thought of it that way. Wasn't sure he wanted to standing here now. But the girl had a way of asking questions that cut straighter than most people twice her age. Maybe, he admitted. Maybe I just didn't have it in me to watch something else die on my land, without trying to stop it first. Winona nodded slowly, like that answer satisfied something in her. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Small but genuine, the first real smile he'd seen from her. My sister likes you, she said. She would never say it. She would deny it if you asked. But I have known her 19 years. I know what her silence means when she is around you. It is different than her silence around everyone else, Winona. I only say this because someone should. Winona said, unbothered by his discomfort, because we may not have much time left to say true things out loud. And true things deserve to be spoken before the world finds a way to make speaking them impossible. Silas didn't know what to say to that. Sat with it, instead, the way he'd learned to sit with most hard things these past 2 years. You talk like someone twice your age, he finally said. Running from death teaches a person quickly, Winona said. Faster than any other teacher I have known. They sat in silence after that, watching Ranger shift his weight in the fading light. Watching the first stars appear over a horizon that had delivered so much trouble and, somehow, so much unexpected grace in the same handful of days. Later, after Winona had gone inside to sleep, Silas found himself back at the mantel, back at the small tin box. He didn't know why he kept returning to it. Maybe because some part of him needed to understand the flicker he'd seen cross a pony's face days ago. Needed to understand it before he could trust the ground he was standing on. He opened the lid, took the bracelet out this time, held it up to the firelight. Sibyl beads, blue and white, arranged in a pattern that looped and repeated. The kind of design that might mean nothing to an untrained eye and everything to someone who'd grown up around it. You're looking at it again, he turned. A pony stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Couldn't sleep, he said. Which was true, though not the whole truth. She crossed the room, slower than he expected. Careful, the way a person moves towards something that might hurt them if handled wrong. May I, she asked, holding out one hand. He passed it to her. She turned it over in her fingers. Traced the pattern with her thumb, the way you'd trace a memory instead of an object. This is not a common pattern, she finally said. Not something a trader sells at a post. Not something copied casually. She looked up at him. This is family work, passed hand to hand. Mother to daughter. Eleanor's grandmother taught her the beadwork, Silas said. That's all I know. She never told me more than that. Did she ever say where the pattern came from? Which family? Which people? No, he frowned, trying to recall conversations 2 years gone. Conversations he hadn't thought to treasure properly while he still had the chance to ask more questions. She said it was a gift, said it carried a story she'd tell me one day. She never got the chance. A pony's hand tightened slightly around the bracelet. There is a story, she said slowly, that my grandmother used to tell, about a debt owed to an outsider. A woman, not of our people, who did something once that can never fully be repaid. She shook her head, as if trying to shake the thought loose before it took a shape she wasn't ready for. It is an old story, half remembered. I was very young when I heard it. My grandmother always ended it the same way. The river gave back what it almost took. I never understood what she meant as a child. I am not certain I understand it now. A river, Silas repeated, something stirring in him he couldn't name. Perhaps it means nothing, a pony said. Perhaps it is only the shape old stories take, when no one remembers the true edges of them anymore. She handed the bracelet back to him carefully, like returning something borrowed. It is probably nothing, Silas. I should not have let it unsettle me the way it did. But her eyes said otherwise. Her eyes said this had unseld something deep and old, something with roots reaching further back than either of them yet understood. Silas closed his hand around the bracelet, felt its familiar weight, the weight he'd carried through 2 years of grief without ever once suspecting it. Held threads reaching backward into a history far larger than his own small, broken life. Maybe it's nothing, he agreed. Though neither of them sounded convinced. Maybe, Apache echoed. Get some rest, Silas finally said. Tomorrow we'll need us both steady. Apache nodded, turned to go, paused at the doorway. Silas, yeah. Thank you. For not looking at us the way your neighbor looked at us today. A beat. For not looking at us the way most of your people look at mine. You're not most people's idea of anything, Silas said. You're just 2 women who needed help. That's all I ever saw. Something passed across her face. Gratitude, maybe. Or the beginning of something gentler than gratitude. Something neither of them was ready to name yet either. Then she was gone, disappearing into the dark room where her sister slept. Leaving Silas alone, with the fire and the bracelet and 100 new questions, crowding out the 2 years of silence. He'd grown so used to living inside. He closed the tin box, set it back on the mantel. But sleep, when it finally came, brought no answers. Only the same restless, half-formed dreams he'd had every night since Eleanor's fever. Except this time, for the first time in 2 years, a new face drifted through them alongside hers. Dark eyes. A guarded voice slowly learning to trust. A pattern of blue and white beads stretching backward through time toward some story still waiting to be told. Somewhere out past that horizon, though Silas couldn't have known it yet, a man named Nokosi Blackfeather was reading tracks in the sand, following a trail 3 days cold, but not yet cold enough to lose. And somewhere further still, in a village built along a river that hadn't yet failed the way Silas's well had failed him, a chief named Chogan Redcloud sat awake through the night, staring into a fire, wrestling with a decision no father should Hannah make. Whether to believe the man who claimed his daughters were thieves, or to trust the daughters who had vanished into the desert rather than stay and be judged. The fire gave him no answers, just like Silas's well gave him no water. Both men, unknown to each other, sat with the same kind of silence that night. The silence of waiting for a truth neither of them could yet see coming. 5 days gone, one promised, and somewhere between the man hunting them and the father who might already believe the worst, 3 lives had quietly become tangled into one single, fragile thread, a thread that would either hold or break, depending on what the next dawn decided to bring. Dawn came without mercy. Silas woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse. Several, moving fast, moving purposeful, the kind of rhythm that didn't belong to wild mustangs or wandering cattle. He was on his feet before his mind caught up to his body, grabbed the rifle from beside the door, looked out the window. Nothing yet, just dust rising somewhere past the ridge, gold and thin in the early light. A pony. His voice came out rougher than he meant it. A pony, wake up. She was already awake. Had been awake, apparently, since before he had. Standing near the window, still as stone, eyes fixed on that same rising dust. How many? She said. Not a question, really. More like she was hoping he'd tell her a number smaller than the one she'd already guessed. Can't tell yet. Guess 3. Maybe 4. Her jaw tightened. Nokosi doesn't travel with more than that. He wouldn't want witnesses to what he plans to do. Winona appeared in the doorway behind them, moving slower than her sister, the wound still stiffening her leg, but her eyes were sharp. Sharp and afraid in a way Silas hadn't seen since that first day in the desert. He found us, she said. We don't know that yet, Silas said. We know it, Apache said. Flat. Certain. Because nothing else rides this hard toward nothing. Silas's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. Fight, hide, run. Explain. Every choice a door leading to some new kind of disaster. Get inside, he said. Both of you. Stay low. Stay quiet, and you, Apache said. I'll handle it. Handle it how? However I have to. She grabbed his arm before he could turn away, her grip fierce, urgent. Nothing careful about it now. Don't be a hero, she said. Heroes die out here. I've seen it, I'm not planning on dying. Neither did the last 3 men I watched die. That stopped him cold, but there wasn't time to unpack it. The dust was closer now, close enough that he could make out shapes. Riders, 4 of them. Just as he'd guessed, inside he said again. Firmer this time, please. Something in his voice must have carried enough weight, because she released his arms, pulled her sister back through the door, back into the shadow of the house. Silas stood alone on the porch, rifle in hand, though not raised. Not yet. Waiting. The riders slowed as they approached. 4 men, dust-caked, faces hard with the particular exhaustion of a chase that had gone on longer than expected. At the front rode a man Silas didn't recognize but somehow knew immediately, broad-shouldered. A scar cutting through one eyebrow. Eyes that scanned the property with the efficient coldness of a predator counting exits. Nokosi, he didn't need a pony to confirm it. Something in the man's bearing told the whole story before a single word passed between them. Nokosi reined his horse to a stop 20 feet from the porch. The 3 men behind him spread out, slow and deliberate. The kind of formation men use when they want a target surrounded. Before anyone notices, they've been surrounded. You have something of mine, Nokosi said. English, accented but clear. Clearly a man who'd learned it for exactly this kind of moment. Don't believe I do, Silas said. 2 women. Passed through here, I think. Maybe still here. Haven't seen anyone. Nokosi's eyes moved past him, to the house. To the window where a curtain had gone very still. The stillness of someone forcing themselves not to move. Strange, Nokosi said. For a man living alone. Your well has 2 extra buckets by the door. Your fire has cooked for more than 1 mouth these last days. And your horse. His gaze drifted to the corral, to Ranger standing there weak but upright. Your horse looks stronger than a man in your condition should be able to afford. Someone's been sharing rations with him too. Silas kept his face flat, kept his voice flatter. Observant fella, he said. Still doesn't answer the question of what business it is of yours. Nokosi smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. 2 sisters ran from justice, he said. Stole something sacred from our people. I have been sent to bring them back. Sent by who? By duty. That's not a person's name. Something flickered across Nokosi's face. Irritation, maybe. At being questioned by a man he'd clearly expected to intimidate into silence. You're protecting thieves, Nokosi said. Do you understand what that makes you, in the eyes of both our peoples? A man harboring guilt. A man who will be remembered as complicit when the truth comes out. Funny, Silas said. From where I'm standing, all I see is a man who rode 50 miles chasing 2 starving women instead of chasing the truth. The words landed harder than Silas expected. He watched Nokosi's jaw tighten, watched the careful mask slip, for just a fraction of a second, revealing something uglier underneath. You don't know what you're protecting. Nokosi said, voice dropping low. You don't know what she is. She's someone who didn't deserve to be shot with a poisoned arrow for, say, to a marriage she didn't want, Silas said. That much I know for certain. The silence that followed stretched thin enough to snap. Nokosi's hand drifted toward the weapon at his hip. Silas's grip on the rifle tightened, though he still didn't raise it. Neither man moved. The 3 riders behind Nokosi shifted uneasily, sensing the moment tipping toward something none of them could undo. Then, from the house, the door opened, a pony stepped out. Silas felt his stomach drop. A pony. Get back. No, she said. Simple. Final. This ends now. Or it never ends. Nokosi's expression shifted the instant he saw her. Something almost like relief crossed his face, quickly buried under a mask of authority. A pony, he said. Come home. This can still be simple. There is nothing simple about a lie, she said. You know I never touched that lodge. I know what I saw. You know what you wanted people to believe you saw. Her voice didn't waver, didn't rise, just cut, clean and precise, through every carefully constructed story he'd built. You could not have me as a wife. So you decided to have me as a criminal instead. At least that way. I would still belong to your story. Nokosi's face darkened. "Careful," he said. Words like that, spoken in front of witnesses, could be considered a confession of guilt, or they could be considered the truth, Apache said. "Which one frightens you more?" For a moment, nobody breathed. Silas watched Nokosi's hand hover near his weapon, watched the calculation happening behind his eyes. 4 men against 1 rancher and 2 exhausted women. Odds that should have favored him completely, except Silas had already decided something in the last 30 seconds. Decided he wasn't stepping aside. Decided that whatever came next, it wasn't happening without a fight. He raised the rifle, slow, deliberate. "You've got a choice," Silas said. "Ride away peaceful, or find out exactly how far a soft man will go to protect what's his." Nokosi looked at the rifle, looked at Silas's face, hard and unmoving, looked finally at his own 3 men, none of whom seemed particularly eager to die over another man's grudge. "This isn't finished," Nokosi said. Low, venomous. "I'll return. With more men. With her father's blessing. Once he hears how she's been living out here. Alone with a white man. No chaperone. No honor. You'll return with lies," Apache said. "Same as always." Nokosi held her gaze a moment longer. Something passed across his face, not quite defeat, but close enough to it that his men noticed, exchanging glances of their own. Then he wheeled his horse around. 3 days, he said, not looking back. 3 days. And I return with enough riders that your rifle won't matter. The 4 of them rode off, dust swallowing them whole within minutes, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the confrontation itself. Silas lowered the rifle, hands shaking now that the danger had passed, the adrenaline draining out of him all at once. "That was reckless," he said, turning to Apache. "That was necessary," she said. "He needed to see I wasn't hiding." "Hiding only feeds the story he tells. He's coming back, I know. With more men." "I know that too." She looked at him, something fierce and frightened tangled together in her expression. "Which is why we cannot stay, Silas. Not after today. Every hour we remain, the danger to you multiplies." Silas looked past her, toward the house, toward Winona standing in the doorway, pale and shaking despite trying hard not to show it. 3 days. 3 days to figure out how to save 2 women he'd known for less than a week, from a man who'd already proven he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. 3 days that suddenly felt like no time at all. That night, sleep refused to come for any of them. Silas sat by the fire, turning over every possibility he could think of, discarding them one by one. Because running only worked if you had somewhere safer to run to. Because staying only worked if he could somehow convince an entire village of the truth. Before Nokosi convinced them of his lie first. Because fighting only worked until it didn't. Until the numbers finally caught up with him, which left almost nothing, except maybe there was one thing left. He looked toward the corral, toward Ranger's silhouette, barely visible in the moonlight. Weak still, but standing. Eating better than he had in weeks, thanks to rations Silas could barely spare but gave anyway. An idea began forming. Reckless, probably foolish. The kind of idea a desperate man reaches, for when every sensible option has already burned away. He found Apache awake too, sitting near the window, watching the dark horizon like Nokosi might materialize out of it at any moment. "I have a plan," he said. "Does it involve dying?" she asked, not looking away from the window. "Might." "Then I don't like it already." "You don't have to like it. You just have to listen." She turned to look at him then, arms crossed, expression guarded but curious despite herself. "Talk. You take the horse," Silas said. "Ranger. Tomorrow, before dawn. Before Nokosi has any chance of returning early, you and Winona ride hard toward your father's village. You get there first. You tell your side of the story before Nokosi's lie has a chance to poison the ground ahead of you." Apache's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession. Confusion, then understanding, then something like horror. "That horse is barely strong enough to carry his own weight," she said. "You want him to carry 2 riders across open desert. He's stronger every day. Not strong enough for that, maybe." Maybe not. But it's better odds than staying here and waiting for Nokosi to return with reinforcements. And what happens to you? Apache said, voice rising now, sharper than he'd heard it since that first desperate day. You give away your only horse, your only way to work this land, to escape if danger comes for you too. What happens to you, Silas, when Nokosi returns and finds you here with nothing left to defend yourself and no way to run? Silas didn't answer right away, because the honest answer wasn't one either of them wanted spoken aloud. I'll manage, he finally said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Apache stood, paced to the far wall and back, agitation radiating off her in waves. You would give away everything. For two strangers you've known 5 days. You stopped being strangers on day 1, Silas said quietly. Somewhere between carrying your sister through that door and watching you hold her hand all night, you both stopped being strangers to me. Apache stopped pacing, stared at him, something raw and unguarded flickering across her face, before she could catch it and pull the mask back into place. Why, she said. Simple word. Everything folded inside it. Same question he'd asked her days before about her father, now turned back on him. Because somebody taught me once that a person's worth isn't measured by what they hold on to, Silas said. It's measured by what they're willing to let go of, when letting go is the only thing that'll save somebody else. Apache was quiet a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone soft, stripped of its usual guard. Your wife, she said. Not a question, Eleanor, Silas confirmed. She used to say things like that. I used to think it was just talk. Turns out she was right about a lot of things I only understood after she was gone. Something shifted in Apache's expression. Not quite tears, but close enough to their edge that she looked away before he could see them fully form. I cannot accept this, she finally said. Not the horse. Not this sacrifice. You don't have a choice, Silas said. Because I've already decided, and once I decide something, Apache, I tend to see it through. Stubborn man learned from the best. A ghost of a smile crossed her face despite everything. Gone almost as fast as it appeared, but he'd seen it. Filed it away, the way he'd started filing away every small crack in her armor since the day she arrived. Winona will fight this decision too, she warned. Let her fight. Doesn't change the math. 2 riders on a horse beat, 2 riders on foot every single time. Apache looked toward the corral one more time, toward the horse that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, been growing stronger with each passing day since 2 exhausted strangers had stumbled onto this land. He's been improving, she admitted quietly. Faster than any sick horse should improve. Maybe he had a reason to fight, Silas said. Same as the rest of us. Winona did fight the decision, exactly as her sister predicted. No, she said flatly. The moment Silas explained the plan the next morning. Absolutely not. We will not leave you here defenseless. You'll leave me here with a rifle and a locked door, Silas said, which is considerably better than leaving Nokosi 3 days to gather reinforced. While we all sit around, waiting to be outnumbered, there must be another way. I've spent all night looking for another way. This is the only one that gives you both a real chance. And what chance does it give you? Winona demanded. You cannot outrun 4 armed men on foot. You cannot even reach town for help without a horse. I'll manage, Silas said. Same words he'd given Apache. Same hollow comfort offered because it was the only comfort available. That is not good enough, Winona said, voice cracking now, the careful composure she'd maintained since her fever broke, finally splintering under the weight of this new fear. We already almost lost each other once, out there in that desert. I will not lose you too, simply because you decided your life mattered less than ours. The words hit Silas harder than he expected, harder than he wanted to admit. Standing there in the pale morning light with 2 women who'd become somehow, in less than a week, people whose safety mattered to him more than his own. Your life doesn't matter less than mine, he said, quiet but firm. It matters exactly the same. Which is why I can live with this choice. And I couldn't live with the alternative. Winona opened her mouth to argue further, Apache placed a hand on her sister's arm, stopping her. He's already decided, Apache said softly. I tried everything last night. He won't be moved. Then we're doomed to argue with a mule of a man, Winona muttered. Though something in her voice had softened, the fight draining out into something closer to resigned grief. I prefer stubborn, Silas offered. Sounds less insulting. It's the same thing, Winona said. But the corner of her mouth twitched, despite everything, into something almost like a smile. They spent the remainder of the morning preparing. Silas packed what little food remained, enough for 2 days of hard riding, if they were careful, filled 2 canteens with water he could barely spare, telling himself the well might recover before he desperately needed it again, knowing even as he thought it that the lie wouldn't hold much longer. They left before dawn the next morning. Silas helped Winona onto Ranger's back first, careful of her still healing leg, then helped Apache swing up behind her. The horse shifted under the unfamiliar weight, uncertain, testing his own strength like a man relearning to walk after a long illness. For one terrible moment, Silas thought he might buckle entirely. Then Ranger steadied, found his footing, stood firm beneath 2 riders who represented, in that instant, everything worth fighting for on a piece of land that had given Silas nothing but grief for 2 straight years. He'll hold, Silas said, though he wasn't entirely certain, and everyone present knew it. Apache looked down at him from the horse's back. Dawn light catching her face, softening the guarded edges that had defined her since the day she arrived. Come with us, she said suddenly. Leave this place. Come to my father's village. Explain everything yourself. Silas shook his head. If I run too, it looks exactly like guilt, like we've got something to hide. Better I stay here. Face whatever Nokosi brings. Prove there's nothing here worth being afraid of. That's not a plan, Apache said. That's a man volunteering to be a target. Maybe, Silas admitted, but it buys you time. And time is the only currency that matters right now. Apache's jaw tightened, fighting some emotion she clearly didn't want to name aloud, not with her sister sitting right in front of her, not with dawn breaking cold and gray around them. If something happens to you, she said, voice rough, I will never forgive myself for taking your only horse and leaving you defenseless. Then don't let anything happen to me, Silas said. Ride fast, reach your father. Bring back the truth before Nokosi brings back his lie. She held his gaze a long moment. Something passed between them in that silence. Something neither of them had words ready for yet. Something too new and too fragile to survive being spoken aloud in the middle of so much danger. 2 days, she finally said. We ride hard. We reach the village by tomorrow evening. If my father believes us, if he believes us in time, we return with enough riders to protect this land. And you from whatever Nokosi brings, and if he doesn't believe you. Apache didn't answer that. Didn't need to. The silence said everything the words couldn't. Go, Silas said, stepping back from the horse. Before I talk myself into stopping you. Winona leaned down, one hand reaching for his. Thank you, she said, for everything. For seeing us as more than the story people wanted to tell about us. Ride safe, Silas said, throat tight in a way he hadn't expected. Both of you. Apache nudged the horse forward. Ranger took 1 step, then another. Steadier than Silas had dared hope, carrying 2 riders across ground that, 4 days ago, he'd barely been strong enough to cross alone. Silas watched them go until the horizon swallowed them whole, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into nothing but wind and silence. And the terrible, hollow quiet of a man standing alone on land that suddenly felt far too large and far too empty. He turned back toward the house, toward a rifle with limited ammunition, toward a well with no water, toward 3 days that stood between him and whatever Nokosi intended to bring back with him. 2 days into their absence, trouble arrived early. Silas heard the wagon again. Walter's wagon, unmistakable now, the particular rattle he'd grown to dread over the past week. But this time it wasn't alone. 3 other wagons followed behind it, and several men on horseback flanking them. Faces, Set hard with the particular righteous of people who've convinced themselves they're doing something necessary. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, though he kept it lowered, counting faces, recognizing most of them from town. Men he'd traded with, drunk with, buried neighbors alongside over the years. None of them looked at him now the way they used to. Walter climbed down first, expression grim. Silas. We need to talk. Talk? Silas said. Word spread further than I expected. Some Apache rider came through town yesterday, asking questions, stirring up old fears. Said you were harboring fugitives. Said danger was coming this way because of it. Walter gestured to the men behind him. These folks are scared, Silas. Scared enough to come out here and see the truth for themselves. There's nothing to see, Silas said. They're gone. Left 2 days back, convenient timing. One of the other men called out. Silas recognized him vaguely, ran the feed store in town. Never much liked Silas even in better years. Not convenient, Silas said. Necessary. Same man who's been spreading fear through your town is the same man who shot an innocent girl with a poisoned arrow because she refused to marry him. That's the truth you're all so scared of. That's the story you were told, Walter said, not unkindly but firm. Doesn't make it fact. I watched the wound myself, Walter. Watched the poison eat through her leg. That's not a story. That's something I cleaned with my own 2 hands. The gathered men exchanged uneasy glances, the certainty in their expressions wavering slightly under Silas's steady insistence. But fear, once planted, doesn't uproot easily. Even if that's true, Walter said carefully, you understand the position you've put us all in. Within 20 miles now believes there's conflict brewing between the settlements and the tribes because of what happened here. Doesn't matter whose fault it actually is. Fear spreads regardless of facts. So what? Silas said. You've come to run me off my own land? Over rumors? We've come to ask you to reconsider your position, Walter said. Before it costs more than just your own safety. Silas looked around at the assembled faces. Men he'd known for years, now looking at him like a stranger. Like someone dangerous. All because he'd chosen compassion over the comfortable silence of prejudice. I made my choice 5 days ago, he said, watching 2 starving women stagger out of the desert. I'm not unmaking that choice now because a lie got there before the truth had a chance to catch up. Then you're choosing them over your own community. Someone called from the back. I'm choosing what's right over what's easy, Silas said. Didn't realize those were supposed to be the same thing out here. The confrontation hung there, tense and unresolved, until Walter finally raised a hand, quieting the murmurs building among the other men. We're not here to hurt you, Silas, he said. Just here to make sure you understand what you're risking. And to make sure, if trouble does come, it doesn't spread past your fence line on to the rest of us. Trouble already came, Silas said. Rode up here 2 days ago with 4 armed men threatening to return with more. If you're looking for someone to blame for danger reaching your town, look toward the man who started the chase. Not the man who tried to stop it. Nobody had an answer for that. The silence stretched long enough that Walter finally climbed back onto his wagon, gesturing for the others to do the same. 3 days, he said, echoing, without realizing it, the same deadline Nokosi had given. If this doesn't resolve itself peaceful within 3 days, Silas, the town's going to take matters into its own hands. I'd rather that not happen. But I can't promise I'll be able to stop it if it does. The wagons pulled away, one by one, dust rising thick behind them, leaving Silas alone again, on a porch that had become, in the span of 1 week, the center of 2 separate storms threatening to collide directly overhead. He sat down heavily on the steps, rifle across his knees. Eyes fixed on the empty horizon, where a pony and Winona had disappeared 2 mornings before. 2 days gone. 1 day left, by his own count, before Nokosi's promised return. Maybe 3, by the town's ultimatum, though that math offered little comfort given how quickly fear seemed to be traveling these days. Come on, Ranger, he murmured to the empty corral. Though the horse was long gone now, carrying hope toward a village that might or might not choose to believe it. "Don't let me down now. Not after everything," the wind answered with nothing but dust and silence. That night, alone in a house that had never felt so large or so empty, Silas found himself back at the tin box on the mantel, back at Eleanor's bracelet. He didn't open it right away. Just stood there, staring at the closed lid, thinking about debts and patterns, and stories half-remembered by a woman 2,000 miles removed from wherever those threads had first been woven. A knock at the door nearly stopped his heart. Too soon for Nokosi's 3 days. Too soon for the town's ultimatum. His hand found the rifle before his mind had fully processed the sound. He opened the door carefully. Found, instead of danger, an old man standing there. Stooped, weathered, a peddler's cart parked behind him, loaded with tin goods and dried provisions. A face Silas half recognized from occasional visits over the years, though he couldn't place a name to it. "Evening," the old man said, tipping his hat. "Name's Cormac. I trade this route twice a year. Maybe you recall. Wasn't expecting to find anyone still holding out here, given the drought and all the talk in town." "What talk?" Silas said, though he already suspected the answer. "Apache trouble. Poisoned arrows. Angry warriors riding the territory." Cormac shook his head. "Ugly business. Whatever the truth of it turns out to be." Something in the word poison snagged Silas's attention. "You said poisoned arrows," he said carefully. "You know something about that." Cormac's expression shifted, wary now. The particular caution of a man who said more than he intended to a stranger. "Might," he admitted. "Peddlers hear things. See things too, moving through as much territory as I do. What have you seen?" The old man hesitated, glancing past Silas toward the dark interior of the house, as if checking for unseen witnesses before he spoke further. "There's a man," Cormac finally said. "Buys poison from me sometimes. Different kind than most use for pests or predators. Slow-acting, cruel stuff, truth told. Never liked selling it, but a man's got to eat, and coin's coin regardless of what it buys this man. Does he have a scar? Through one eyebrow." Cormac's eyebrows rose. "You know him?" "Enough to know he's dangerous. Enough to know he used what you sold him." "On an innocent girl." The old man's face paled slightly. "I didn't know," he said. "Swear it. Man never told me what he wanted it for. Just paid well, kept coming back for more. How long has he been buying from you?" 2 years, maybe. First time he came through, actually, he wasn't alone." Cormac frowned, digging through old memory. "Came with an older fellow. Different tribe entirely, I think, though I never was good at telling the difference between territories. Older man seemed uneasy about the whole transaction. Almost like he was there, to keep an eye on the younger one, not to buy anything himself." Something cold moved through Silas's chest. The older man. "Did he have a name? Might have mentioned one." "Been a while." Cormac scratched at his beard, thinking. "Something like Chogan, I believe." "Yes, that sounds right." Silas felt the ground shift beneath him. "You're certain?" "Certain as an old memory allows," Cormac said. "Why? Does the name mean something to you?" Silas didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, connecting threads that shouldn't have connected, pulling together a picture that made his stomach twist with something between hope and dread. If Chogan had been present 2 years ago, when Nokosi first purchased poison from this peddler, had been there almost as a chaperone, uneasy about the transaction, then perhaps the chief already harbored doubts about Nokosi, long before his daughters ever fled into the desert. Perhaps the seeds of suspicion had been planted long before the accusation of theft ever surfaced, which meant the truth might have a better chance of reaching him than Silas had dared hope. "It might mean everything," Silas finally said. "Or it might mean nothing at all." Too soon to tell, Cormac studied him a moment longer, curiosity plain on his weathered face, but he didn't press further. Peddlers learned early not to ask more questions than their trade required. "Well," he said instead, gesturing back toward his cart. "I've got provisions if you're interested. Can't offer much credit given the state of things, but I haven't got coin to spare," Silas said. "Haven't had for months." Cormac studied him a moment, something almost kind passing across his weathered features. Then, without a word, he reached into his cart and produced a small sack of dried meat, pressing it into Silas's hands before he could protest. "On the house," Cormac said. "Man who stands against something that ugly deserves better than an empty stomach while he does it. I can't accept charity." "Wasn't charity," Cormac said, already turning back toward his cart. "Call it a debt repaid. Every peddler worth his salt has a few of those he's never quite settled." He climbed back onto his cart, taking up the reins. "Careful out here, son. Whatever's coming, it sounds like it's coming soon." He rode off into the darkening evening, leaving Silas alone once more. Though this time not quite as hopeless as before, Chogan, present at the first purchase. Uneasy about it even then. It wasn't proof. Wasn't even close to proof. But it was a thread, a single thread reaching backward through 2 years of quiet suspicion, suggesting that perhaps the chief's faith in his daughters, deeper than Nokosi's lies, had accounted for. Silas returned to the house, sat by the dying fire, turned the small sack of dried meat over in his hands, thinking about debts repaid and debts still owed, about a peddler's unexpected kindness and a bracelet's unexplained pattern, about all the small, invisible threads that seemed to be quietly weaving themselves together around him, without his full understanding of the shape they were forming. He didn't sleep much that night either. Meanwhile, across 50 miles of darkening desert, Apache and Winona pushed their exhausted horse toward a horizon neither of them was entirely certain they'd reach in time. "How much further?" Winona asked, voice thin with exhaustion, gripping the reins in front of her sister with white-knuckled determination. "Not far now," Apache said, though in truth, she wasn't entirely certain herself. The landscape had begun to blur together, somewhere around midday. Familiar landmarks, swallowed by heat and fatigue, and the relentless pressure of time running out beneath them. "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true. Closer each time I say it." Winona managed a tired laugh, thin and breathless. "Your logic has holes, sister. My logic is keeping us moving forward. That's all it needs to do right now." They rode in silence. After that, the only sound, the steady rhythm of rangers' hooves against sun-baked earth, still holding strong despite 2 riders and 2 days of hard travel that should have, by any reasonable expectation, broken him long before now. "Do you think he's all right?" Winona finally asked. Silas. Apone's jaw tightened, the question landing somewhere tender she hadn't quite prepared herself to examine. She said carefully, "that he is exactly the kind of stubborn man who convinces himself he's all right, regardless of the actual dangers surrounding him." That wasn't an answer. "It's the only answer I've got." Winona twisted slightly in the saddle, studying her sister's face despite the awkward angle. "You care for him. I care what happens to him." "There's a difference, is there?" Winona said, something knowing in her tired voice. "Because from where I'm sitting, the difference looks very thin indeed. He reminds me of someone," Apache finally said, voice quiet. "Not in appearance. In the way he chooses kindness even when kindness costs him everything. I have not met many people like that. Not since," she stopped herself. "Since our mother," Winona finished softly. Apone's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to trust her voice with more words just yet. "She would have liked him," Winona said, "I think. She always said, the measure of a person wasn't in what they had, but in what they were willing to risk for someone else." Something in those words struck Apache with unexpected force, an echo, faint but unmistakable, of something Silas had told her just 2 nights before, about a lesson his own late wife had taught him. The same lesson. Nearly the same words, passed down through 2 entirely separate lives that had somehow, impossibly, arrived at the exact same truth. She said nothing about the coincidence, filed it away instead, alongside the bracelet, alongside the half-remembered story of a river, giving back what it almost took, alongside every other small strange thread that seemed to be quietly gathering around them as this journey unfolded. "We should ride faster," she said instead, urging Ranger forward with renewed urgency. Whatever waits for us at the village, whatever waits for him back at that ranch, the sooner we arrive, the sooner we can begin fixing it. They reached the outskirts of the village as the last light faded from the sky. Word of their arrival spread ahead of them like fire through dry grass. Faces emerging from lodges and fires to watch two exhausted sisters ride in on a horse nobody recognized, both women bearing the unmistakable marks of a hard, desperate journey. Chogan Red Cloud emerged from his own lodge before they'd fully entered the village proper. Moving faster than a man his age should have been able to move, his face a mixture of relief and fear so tangled together that for a moment he seemed frozen entirely by the collision of both emotions at once, a pony. Winona, his voice cracked on their names. 2 years of a father's private terror, finally breaking through the careful composure he'd maintained since they first vanished into the desert. You're alive, you're. He reached them just as a pony slid down from the horse, catching her in an embrace fierce enough to lift her briefly off her feet. The kind of embrace that spoke louder than any words could have managed. We're alive, a pony confirmed, voice muffled against her father's shoulder, barely. But alive. Chogan pulled back, studying her face, then Winona's taking in every detail. The exhaustion, the healing wound visible on Winona's leg, the particular hollowness that came from days spent running from something larger than either of them should have had to face alone. Nokosi came to me, he said, voice tight with barely controlled anger. Told me you had stolen the sacred bundle. Told me you fled rather than face judgment. Lies, a pony said immediately fiercely. Every word. I never entered that lodge. Neither did Winona, I know, Chogan said, surprising both his daughters into stunned silence. You know, Winona repeated, disbelief plain in her voice. I have suspected for some time, Chogan said, weariness evident beneath his relief. Nokosi's story never sat right with me. Too convenient. Too eager the way he pressed for judgment before proper investigation could occur. He shook his head slowly. I sent trackers after you both. Not to bring you back for punishment, but to bring you back safely, while I worked to uncover the truth here. But days passed with no word, and I feared, his voice broke slightly. I feared the worst had already happened. We were found, Winona said, by a man, a rancher. He saved my life when the poison Nokosi used nearly ended it. Chogan's expression darkened instantly. Poison, an arrow, a pony confirmed, meant as a warning, according to Nokosi. Meant to force our return through fear rather than truth. Chogan's hands clenched at his sides, something dangerous flickering behind his eyes. The particular fury of a father who has just learned exactly how close he came to losing everything. This rancher, he said slowly, the one who saved you. What is his name? Silas, a pony said. Silas Whitfield. Something shifted in Chogan's expression at the name. A flicker of recognition, quickly masked, though not quite quickly enough to escape his daughter's notice. Father, a pony said carefully. Do you know that name? Chogan was quiet for a long moment, staring past them, past the gathered villagers, toward the darkening horizon in the direction they'd come from. Perhaps, he finally said, perhaps I know a story that shares it. An old story. One I have not spoken aloud in many years. What story? Winona pressed, but Chogan shook his head, expression suddenly guarded in a way that reminded a pony uncomfortably of her own careful silences over the past week. Not tonight, he said. Tonight you both need rest, food, proper care for that wound. Tomorrow. We speak of stories and debts, and whatever threads connect this rancher to matters older than either of you understand. There is no time for tomorrow, a pony said urgently. Nokosi promised to return to his ranch within 3 days, with enough men to overwhelm him completely. That deadline arrives tomorrow evening, Father. If we do not act tonight, Chogan's jaw tightened. He looked at his exhausted daughters, at the horse that had carried them safely across 50 miles of unforgiving desert, at the darkening sky above a village that had spent 2 years believing the worst about 2 young women who had, in truth done nothing but refuse an unwanted marriage and pay a terrible price for that refusal. Then we do not wait for tomorrow, he said, voice hardening with sudden resolve. Gather the warriors. Tonight, we ride. Back at the ranch, Silas sat alone through the darkest hours of the night, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on a horizon that offered no answers, only the slow, patient promise of another dawn arriving, regardless of whether he was ready to face what it might bring. Somewhere in the deepest hour of the night, exhaustion finally claimed him. He drifted into uneasy sleep, rifle still cradled against his chest, dreaming, as he had every night since a pony's departure, of dark eyes and blue and white beadwork and a story still waiting, patiently, to reveal its final shape. He woke to the sound of thunder. Except it wasn't thunder. It was hooves, dozens of them, approaching fast across the dry earth, the ground itself seeming to tremble beneath the weight of their arrival. Silas was on his feet instantly, rifle raised, heart hammering with a fear so complete, it left no room for anything else. He moved to the window, looked out, and felt his knees nearly give out beneath him, because this wasn't 4 riders. This wasn't Nokosi's small, cautious hunting party. This was dozens. A great dark line of riders stretching back toward the horizon, dust rising behind them like a storm cloud given shape, moving with a speed and purpose that told him instantly this was no accident of timing. The deadline Nokosi had given still had hours left to run, which meant whoever approached now, in this pale, uncertain light, was arriving on their own schedule, not his. His hand tightened on the rifle. Because whatever this was, rescue or reckoning, he understood immediately that a single weapon and a locked door would offer no meaningful defense against a force this size. He set the rifle down on the porch rail, deliberately, both hands raised, empty, visible, because if this was judgment what, arriving ahead of schedule, he intended to meet it, the same way he'd met everything else these past 2 years, without hiding. Without pretending to be anything other than exactly what he was. The riders drew closer. Close enough now that he could make out individual faces beneath the dust, individual expressions ranging from grim determination to something that looked confusingly, almost like urgency, born of concern, rather than anger. At the front of that great approaching line rode 2 familiar figures. Both women, both exhausted beyond measure, yet sitting straight and proud atop a horse that had somehow, impossibly, carried them the full distance there and back again in less time than Silas had dared hope possible. A pony, Winona, alive, returned. And riding beside them, weathered set with an expression Silas couldn't yet read, a man whose bearing carried the unmistakable authority of someone who led, someone whose decisions shaped the fate of everyone gathered behind him. Chogan Red Cloud had come. The riders came to a stop. Dust settling slowly around them in the pale morning light. And for one long, suspended moment, nobody moved at all, as if the entire desert itself was holding its breath, waiting to discover which way this story would finally break. The silence broke first. Chogan swung down from his horse, slow, deliberate. Every eye in that gathered line of riders following his movement, waiting to see which way this moment would tip. Cyclops stood his ground, hands still raised, heart still hammering against his ribs like something trying to escape. "You are Silas Whitfield," Chogan said. Not a question. A statement weighted with something Silas couldn't name yet. "I am. You saved my daughters. I did what any decent person would have done." Chogan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Decency is rarer than you suggest, especially toward people your community has taught you to fear." Silas didn't have an answer for that. Didn't try to construct one. Just stood there, exposed and uncertain, waiting. "My daughter tells me," Chogan continued, "that you gave them your only horse. Knowing it left you defenseless. Knowing the danger that would follow you here regardless. Seemed like the only choice worth making." Something shifted behind Chogan's eyes. Not quite warmth yet, but the beginning of something less guarded than suspicion. "A pony also tells me," he said, "that you carry a bracelet." Beadwork, blue and white, passed to your wife by her grandmother. He paused. May I see it? Silas blinked, caught off guard by the request. You know about the bracelet. I know a story, Chogan said. One I have carried for many years, never certain if it was true, or simply a comfort my family told itself. In hard winters, his gaze didn't waver. Show me, and I will tell you whether the story and the object are the same thing. Silas lowered his hands slowly, turned toward the house. Behind him, he heard the assembled riders shift, murmurs passing among them, though none moved to stop him. He returned moments later with the tin box, opened it with hands that weren't entirely steady, held the bracelet out toward Chogan. The chief took it carefully, turned it over, in weathered hands the way a pony had, days before. Traced the pattern with one finger, tracing not just beads but years. And then his face changed completely. Something broke open in his expression, grief and recognition and disbelief, all arriving at once, too large for his features to contain gracefully. Where, he said, voice suddenly unsteady. Where did this pattern come from? Tell me everything you know. My wife's grandmother taught her the beadwork, Silas said. That's all I ever knew. Eleanor said it was a gift passed down. Said it carried a story she meant to tell me. She never got the chance, Eleanor, Chogan repeated, testing the name. Something flickering behind his eyes like a door, slowly opening onto a room he hadn't entered in years. Was her family name Marsh, by any chance? Before marriage, Silas felt the ground tilt beneath him. How could you possibly know that? Chogan closed his hand around the bracelet, pressing it briefly against his chest, eyes closing for a long moment as though absorbing a weight he'd carried unspoken for far too long. Because, he said, opening his eyes again, 16 years ago, a young woman named Eleanor Marsh pulled my younger brother from a flooding river, at great risk to her own life, when he was a boy of 10 and I was a young man, too far away to reach him in time. The words landed like a physical blow. Silas staggered slightly, one hand finding the porch rail to steady himself. That's not possible, he said. Eleanor never mentioned. She was young herself, Chogan said. Perhaps 15, 16 winters, traveling with her family near the territory line. My brother had wandered too close to the water during spring flooding, been swept from the bank before anyone could reach him. His voice thickened with old emotion, no less raw for the passage of time. She did not hesitate, dove in after him, pulled him to shore, though the current nearly took them both. Then she was gone. Before my father could even learn her full name, before our family could properly repay what could never truly be repaid, Silas felt something crack open inside his chest, grief and wonder colliding in a way he'd never experienced, not even during the darkest days after Eleanor's death. She never told me, he whispered. 12 years married, and she never once mentioned saving a stranger's life. Perhaps she did not think of it as remarkable, Chogan said gently. Perhaps, to her, it was simply what a good person does when someone needs saving. The same instinct, I suspect, that led you to open your door to two exhausted strangers 5 days ago. Silas looked down at the bracelet in Chogan's hand, understanding slowly, impossibly, the shape of a story that had been quietly circling him for days, without his awareness. The bracelet, he said. The pattern. My mother made that pattern, Chogan said. Wove it into a gift my father carried for years, hoping to one day find the girl who'd saved his son and repay the debt properly. He never found her. She had already moved on, already vanished back into a life none of us knew how to trace. He looked up, meeting Silas's eyes directly. My father passed still carrying that unfulfilled debt, passed the burden of it to me, along with the story, in case fate ever offered a second chance to settle what the river had left unfinished. And now, Silas said slowly, here I am, married to the very woman your family owed everything to, standing exactly where fate apparently decided to bring this story back around. Now here you are, Chogan agreed, something like wonder in his weathered voice. A debt owed to your wife, repaid instead to the man who loved her, standing in the same act of selfless courage, that first created the debt 16 years ago. He shook his head slowly. I do not believe in coincidence this large, Silas Whitfield. I believe the spirits sometimes arrange circumstances too precisely for chance to explain. Behind them, a pony had dismounted, moving closer, her expression a mixture of astonishment and something gentler. Something that looked, for the first time since Silas had met her, entirely unguarded. This is why I couldn't stop looking at the bracelet, she said softly. Some part of me recognized it. Recognized the debt woven into every bead, even before I understood what I was seeing. Then everything, Silas said, struggling to fully absorb the enormity of what had just unfolded. Everything that brought you both to my door, the accusation, the poison, the desert crossing, all of it led directly back to a debt I never even knew existed, or, Winona offered quietly, dismounting to join them. Perhaps the debt simply ensured that whoever found him in that desert would be exactly the kind of person capable of choosing kindness, regardless of what history connected us beforehand. Chogan nodded slowly, still holding the bracelet with a reverence that spoke to years of unresolved grief finally finding its resolution. Either way, he said, the debt is settled now. Not through payment, but through the same courage that created it. Your wife saved a frightened boy from a river that should have killed him. You saved his nieces from a desert that very nearly did the same. He extended the bracelet back towards Silas. Keep this, it belongs with you now, as much as it ever belonged with her. Silas took it with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by grief and gratitude tangled together in a knot he wasn't certain he'd ever fully untangle. Thank you, he managed. No, Chogan said firmly. Thank you. For a debt my family carried for 16 years, finally allowed to rest. The moment of revelation didn't last long before harder matters intruded. Father, a pony said, urgency returning to her voice. Nokosi promised to return today, with more men than we have here defending this ranch. Chogan's expression hardened instantly, the warmth of moments before giving way to something colder, more purposeful. Nokosi will find considerably more waiting for him than he anticipated, he said. I did not ride here with warriors merely to escort my daughters home. I rode here to end this deception permanently. You believe us then, Winona said, fully. About the sacred bundle. I believed you before I ever left the village, Chogan said. Cormac the peddler sent word ahead of you both, actually. Word about a purchase 2 years old. About an old man's uneasy presence during a poison sale he'd long since tried to forget. He shook his head grimly. I have suspected Nokosi's character for some time. This merely confirmed suspicions. I lacked sufficient evidence to act upon until now. As if summoned by his own name spoken one too many times, dust began rising on the far horizon. A smaller cloud than the one Chogan's warriors had raised, but unmistakably approaching, unmistakably purposeful. Nokosi arrived within the hour. 4 riders, exactly as before. Though his confident bearing faltered visibly, the moment he crested the ridge and found not a defenseless rancher, but dozens of warriors, including his own chief, waiting for him instead. He reined his horse to an abrupt stop, color draining from his face. Chogan, he managed, voice unsteady despite obvious effort to maintain composure. I did not expect clearly, Chogan said, voice flat and cold in a way that silenced whatever explanation Nokosi had been preparing. You did not expect the truth to arrive before your lies could finish their work. I don't understand. Don't, Chogan said sharply, the single word carrying more weight than any lengthy accusation could have managed. Cormac the trader remembers you well, Nokosi. Remembers a purchase 2 years ago. Remembers my own uneasy presence during that transaction. Though at the time I did not yet understand what darkness I was witnessing take shape, whatever he claims to remember. Enough, Chogan said. I have heard enough lies from you already. Now I require truth, however painful extracting it proves to be. He gestured to 2 of his warriors who moved forward, flanking Nokosi's horse with quiet, unmistakable authority. You will return to the village with us. You will answer fully for the accusation you fabricated. and for the poison you used against my daughter." "This is madness," Nokosi protested, though his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. "You would believe a rancher and 2 runaway girls over a warrior who has served your village faithfully for. I would believe evidence," Shogun cut in, "over convenient stories told by a man whose motives collapse the moment they're properly examined." He looked toward the 3 riders who'd accompanied Nokosi throughout this pursuit, studying each of their faces carefully. "And I suspect, given the chance to speak freely without fear of Nokosi's retribution, at least one of you might have truths of your own worth sharing." The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the youngest of them, barely more than a boy, Silas realized, watching the exchange unfold, spoke up, voice trembling slightly. "He told us the bundle was hidden," the young man admitted. "Told us we were retrieving stolen property, not hunting innocent women. I did not know about the poison until after it was already done. I would not have." He stopped, shame plain on his young face. "I would not have participated, had I known the full truth from the beginning." Nokosi's expression twisted with fury and betrayal. "You would turn against me now, after everything. I would turn against a lie," the young man said, finding steadier ground beneath his courage, now that the first words had been spoken. Shogun nodded slowly, something like grim satisfaction crossing his weathered features. "There it is," he said. The truth, finally permitted to speak for itself. Once fear stopped forcing silence upon it. "You cannot simply take his word," Nokosi said, voice rising. "One boy frightened into confession. He is not the only witness," Shogun cut in. "Cormac the traitor has already testified to what he remembers. Aponi and Winona have testified to what they endured. And you yourself, Nokosi, have offered nothing in your own defense except accusations against those, with no reason, left to lie." He shook his head slowly. "A guilty man defends himself with facts. An innocent man rarely needs to raise his voice at all." "This is unjust," Nokosi spat, though the words carried less conviction now, cracking under the accumulated weight of evidence. "Unjust," Aponi repeated, stepping forward for the first time since the confrontation began, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade finally unsheathed. "You shot my sister with poison meant to kill her slowly, meant to force our surrender through suffering rather than truth. You call this unjust. When the injustice began the moment you decided a woman's refusal deserved punishment rather than acceptance." Nokosi's jaw tightened, some remaining pride refusing to fully collapse even now. "I loved you," he said quieter, though the word love sounded twisted somehow in his mouth, closer to possession than affection. "You did not love me," Aponi interrupted, voice steady despite the visible effort it cost her. "Love does not poison. Love does not lie. Love does not chase a woman across 50 miles of desert, intending to bring her home only through fear and coercion. What you felt for me, Nokosi, was never love. It was simply wanting something you believed you deserved, regardless of whether I wanted it too." Shogun stepped forward, resting a hand briefly on his daughter's shoulder, silent pride evident in the gesture. "The judgment stands," he said, turning back to face Nokosi directly. "Banishment, effective immediately. You will gather only what you can carry, and you will not return to this territory again, under any circumstance, for any reason." "Fine," Nokosi said, voice hollow now, shoulders sagging with the particular defeat of a man who has run out of lies to hide behind. "Banishment. Though you will regret this leniency, eventually, Shogun." "Perhaps not," Shogun acknowledged. "But you will disappear from here, regardless of what you do elsewhere. That is the only promise I require today." They rode back toward the village that same afternoon, a great procession stretching across the desert. The judgment, when it came, unfolded swiftly once they reached it. Elders gathered, testimony given, and in the end, the punishment handed down was severe but measured. Banishment from the village, permanent and absolute, along with public acknowledgement before the full community of the lie Nokosi had constructed and the harm it had caused. Nokosi said nothing in response. Simply mounted the horse provided for his departure and rode out from the only home he'd ever known, disappearing into a horizon that offered him nothing but the consequences of choices he could no longer take back. "It's over," Winona said beside Silas, voice thick with exhausted relief. "For now," Apache added, more cautious. "Danger rarely disappears entirely. But this danger, at least, has finally been named and answered." The young warrior who'd finally spoken truth approached Chogan hesitantly. "What becomes of us now?" he asked. Chogan studied him a long moment before answering. "You will not be banished, but you will spend this season working alongside the families you frightened with your pursuit, until trust is properly rebuilt between you and them. Trust, once broken, requires more than words to restore." That evening, the village held a gathering, not quite celebration, given everything that had been endured to reach this point, but something adjacent to it. Fires burned bright against the gathering dark. Food was shared. Stories were told, some old, some newly created by the events of the past week. Chogan found Silas sitting somewhat apart from the main gathering, watching the fires with an expression of quiet, overwhelmed contemplation. "You seem troubled," Chogan observed, settling down beside him. "Even now, with danger past and truth restored." "Not troubled exactly," Asaj. "Just trying to understand how a man's whole life can shift this dramatically in the span of 1 week. Ranch failing. Wife 2 years gone. Then 2 strangers stumble out of the desert. And suddenly I'm sitting at a fire 20 miles from home, learning my dead wife saved your family before I ever met her, watching a man banished for crimes against people I'd known less than a week." He shook his head slowly. "Doesn't quite fit together in my mind yet. Might take a while longer before it does." "Some truths take time to properly settle," Chogan agreed. "I have carried the story of the river, of Eleanor Marsh, for many years, and even I did not expect it to resolve itself quite this dramatically." He was quiet a moment, watching the fire. Across the gathering, Nokosi's 3 former companions sat somewhat apart from the celebration, uncertain of their welcome, watching the fires with the particular discomfort of men, still finding their footing after loyalty had proven itself misplaced. The young warrior who had spoken the truth caught Silas's eye once briefly and offered a small, uncertain nod, something between gratitude and apology, offered across a distance. Neither of them had words to close just yet. "What will you do now?" Chogan asked. "Your ranch remains in difficulty. The drought has not lifted, simply because no Kosi has been dealt with." Silas considered the question seriously. "Haven't fully worked that out yet," he admitted. "Land's still dying, wells still dry. Whatever happens next, it won't be easy." "Perhaps," Chogan said carefully, "it need not be faced alone." Silas looked over at him, uncertain what exactly was being offered. "My daughters speak highly of you," Chogan continued. "Winona, with the enthusiasm of someone young enough to still believe good fortune arrives without complication. Apache, more cautiously. Though I have known my eldest daughter long enough to recognize when caution is protecting something rather than denying it entirely." Silas felt heat rise to his face, grateful for the darkness hiding whatever expression had crossed it. "Chogan, I don't know what you're suggesting exactly, but I am suggesting nothing beyond what you're already prepared to consider yourself," Chogan said, something almost amused beneath his measured tone. "I am simply an old man who has watched enough of life unfold to recognize when 2 people have already begun choosing each other, regardless of whether they've found the words for it yet." Across the fire, Apache sat with Winona, laughing at something her younger sister had said, firelight catching the edges of her face in a way that made something ache pleasantly in Silas's chest. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Different worlds, different peoples. The kind of thing that gets a man run out of town if the wrong sort of people decide to make it their business." "Complications rarely stop what's meant to happen," Chogan said. "They simply require more courage in the choosing." He stood, resting a weathered hand briefly on Silas's shoulder. You have already proven you possess courage in abundance, Silas Whitfield. I suspect you'll find enough remaining for this as well, should you decide it's worth pursuing. He walked away, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts and the fire and the sight of a pony laughing softly across the flames. They stayed 3 more days in the village while arrangements were made. Supplies gathered, warriors assigned to help rebuild what the drought and danger had both worn thin. On the morning of their departure back toward the ranch, Chogan gathered a substantial party to accompany them. Not the great line of dozens that had arrived that first dramatic morning, but enough. Enough to bring livestock. Enough to bring seed and grain and materials for repairing a barn that had been leaning toward collapse for longer than Silas cared to admit. "This is too much," Silas protested. "Watching supplies being loaded for transport." "This is appropriate," Chogan corrected. "A debt 16 years unpaid does not settle itself with words alone." He gestured toward the gathered supplies, the livestock. The warriors prepared to help rebuild what circumstance had nearly destroyed. "Let us finish what the river started so long ago." The journey back took 2 full days. Slower than the desperate ride that had brought Apache and Winona to the village originally, but filled with a different quality of urgency entirely. Not fear now, but purpose. Anticipation, even, for what waited at journey's end. They arrived at the ranch to find it exactly as Silas had left it. Dying, dust-choked, barely holding together. By evening of that first day back, it had already begun transforming into something else entirely. Warriors worked alongside Silas, repairing the barn, reinforcing the well housing, preparing ground for planting despite the ongoing drought, trusting that rain would eventually return, as it always eventually did, and that preparation now would matter enormously once it finally arrived. Livestock filled the previously empty corral. Cattle, goats, even a small flock of chickens that Winona claimed as her personal responsibility almost immediately, naming each one within the first hour. Despite Apache's amused protests that naming animals destined for eventual slaughter seemed like an unnecessarily complicated emotional choice. "Not all of them are for slaughter," Winona argued. "Some are for eggs. Those ones deserve names at minimum. All of them will still need names eventually forgotten. Once distinguishing them becomes impractical," Apache said, though her tone carried more affection than actual argument. Silas watched this exchange from across the yard, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest. The particular warmth of a home slowly, unexpectedly, filling back up with life after 2 years of aching emptiness. Rain came 2 days later. Not the gentle kind, but a genuine desert storm. The sky opening with sudden, dramatic fury after months of relentless drought, soaking parched earth that had nearly given up hope of ever feeling moisture again. Silas stood on the porch watching it fall, a pony beside him. Winona somewhere out in the yard, laughing and spinning with her arms outstretched. "She's going to catch cold," Apache observed, though her tone held no real concern. "Let her," Silas said. Some moments deserve celebrating properly, regardless of practical consequences. Apache looked over at him, rain beginning to mist across the porch, dampening loose strands of her dark hair. "You've changed," she observed, "since that first day. When you nearly reached for your rifle before choosing otherwise, you noticed that." "I notice everything," she said. "But this," she gestured toward the rain, toward the transformed ranch around them. "This feels like watching someone remember how to properly live again, rather than simply survive." "Maybe I am," Silas admitted. "Feels that way, some mornings. Like I spent 2 years holding my breath, waiting for something, without knowing what exactly I was waiting for. And now? Now I think I was waiting for exactly this," he said. "Though I'd never have guessed it would arrive, wearing the shape of 2 sisters staggering out of the desert, half dead and completely terrified." Apache laughed softly, the sound bright and genuine against the steady percussion of rain against the roof. "Life rarely announces its gifts clearly in advance," she said. Sometimes it simply delivers them, disguised as crisis, and trusts us to recognize the gift buried inside the difficulty. They watched the rain together a while longer. Winona, still dancing in the yard below, the ranch around slowly, steadily, transforming from a place of dying hope into something entirely different. Something that felt, for the first time in 2 long years, genuinely worth building toward. Months passed. Then a full season. The ranch flourished under combined effort, Chogan's continued support, Silas' tireless work, and the steady presence of two sisters who had, gradually and without much fanfare, simply become permanent fixtures of daily life there. Winona grew into her role as an unofficial bridge between two communities that had spent years regarding each other with suspicion. She traveled frequently between the ranch and the village, carrying goods, carrying stories, carrying the particular kind of hope that comes from watching two separate worlds slowly discover how much more they held in common than they'd ever previously acknowledged. Walter Higgins, to Silas's considerable surprise, became one of the ranch's most frequent visitors. Initial suspicion gradually replaced by genuine respect as he watched the transformation unfold with his own eyes. "Guess I owe you an apology," Walter admitted. One afternoon, watching a pony work alongside Silas repairing fence line with practiced efficiency, was ready to run you off your own land over fear that turned out to be mostly smoke. "Fear usually is," Silas said. "Doesn't make it any less real while you're standing in the middle of it?" "No," Walter agreed. "Suppose it doesn't." He watched a pony a moment longer, something thoughtful crossing his weathered face. "She makes you happy. I can see that plainly enough, even from here." "She does," Silas confirmed simply. "Eleanor would have liked her," Walter said, unexpected gentleness in his gruff voice, something similar about them both. That same kindness, insisting on doing right even when doing right cost plenty. Silas felt his throat tighten, slightly grateful, and moved by an observation he'd quietly suspected himself, but hadn't yet spoken aloud to anyone. "Think you might be right about that," he said softly. Walter lingered a moment, longer, watching the ranch around them, warriors and settlers, working side by side on a fence line that had once symbolized nothing but division. Now simply another shared task between neighbors who'd finally learned to see past old fear. "Town's talking different these days," Walter said. "Word of what happened here, what your Chogan did about that Nokosi fellow, about the truth of it all finally coming out. Changes things, slowly maybe, but it changes things. Slow's still moving forward," Silas said. "I'll take slow, if slow is what's honestly available." Walter had called a pony his wife, without thinking, in passing, and Silas had corrected him. "Not yet," he'd said, and then softer, almost to himself. "Not yet, anyway." The words settled into him with unexpected weight, the particular certainty that arrives not through sudden realization but through the slow, steady accumulation of 100 small moments finally reaching critical mass. He waited until evening, until the work was finished, until Winona had retired to bed, exhausted and content, until the ranch had settled into the particular quiet that arrives once a day of honest labor finally concludes. He found a pony near the garden she'd insisted on planting months earlier, checking on late-season vegetables by lantern light. "Walter said something today," Silas began. "Called you my wife." Before I'd corrected him. Before I'd even thought to correct him, if I'm honest, he stepped closer, close enough now that lantern light caught both their faces equally. "I told him we weren't married." "Not yet," I said, surprised myself, saying it that way. But once I heard myself say it, I understood it was true. He reached into his pocket, producing something small. A ring, simply made. Fashioned from silver he'd been quietly working for weeks in stolen hours between ranch work. A pony's eyes widened, hand rising to her mouth. "I know this isn't simple," Silas said, voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Know there's history between our peoples, that complications like this don't erase overnight. But I also know that 6 months ago, I was a man holding his breath, waiting for a life that had already stopped feeling worth living. And you, his voice caught slightly, you and your sister walked out of that desert and taught me how to breathe again. Taught me grief and love could share the same room, without either one needing to disappear entirely. I'm not asking you to replace anything, he continued. Not Eleanor's memory, not your mother's memory. Just asking if you'll build something new alongside me. He held out the ring. A pony red cloud. Will you marry me? For a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she laughed, a sound bright with joy, breaking through months of careful composure entirely. You stubborn, impossible man, she said, extending her hand toward his. Yes, yes, of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, hands trembling slightly, now that the words had finally been spoken, finally been answered. I love you, he said, the words arriving easily now, no longer requiring the courage they once had. I love you too, a pony said, closing the remaining distance between them. Have. I think since the night you opened that tin box and looked at your wife's bracelet, like it still held every ounce of grief you carried, and somehow found room in that same grief to keep helping two frightened strangers anyway. Behind them, unnoticed, Winona watched from the porch, having woken at the sound of voices, a smile spreading across her face. As autumn approached, with harvest finally promising abundance after months of careful rebuilding, Silas found himself standing once again at Eleanor's grave. A small marker near the edge of the property, where he'd buried her and their daughter 2 years before. He knelt, placing fresh flowers gathered from the now thriving garden. Found out something. About you I never knew, he said quietly. 16 years ago, you pulled a boy from a flooding river. Saved his life without a second thought, then vanished before anyone could properly thank you. He smiled slightly, though his eyes had grown damp. That boy grew up to be a chief. His family carried the debt for years, waiting for a chance to finally repay it. Turns out that chance arrived, wearing the shape of his 2 daughters, stumbling half-dead out of the desert onto our land. I looked out across the ranch, the rebuilt barn, the flourishing garden, the herd grazing peacefully in fields that had been barren dust just months before. I love her, Eleanor, he said. Different than I loved you. Not replacing what we had. Just continuing what you taught me, I suppose. About choosing kindness. About giving everything away, if giving is what love requires. He rose and turned back toward the house, toward warm light spilling from windows, toward a pony standing in the doorway, an expression on her face that held nothing guarded in it anymore. You spoke with her, a pony said softly as he reached the porch, told her about us. Silas confirmed, and I think, Silas said, reaching for a pony's hand, she would have approved completely. Behind them, the ranch stretched out beneath a sky finally, fully healed from drought. Green fields, healthy livestock, a home rebuilt not just in structure, but in every meaning that mattered. A debt 16 years in the making, finally, completely repaid. A grief 2 years carried, finally gently, making room for something new to grow alongside it. And a love neither of them had expected, born from desperation and kindness, and one impossible week that had changed the shape of everything that followed. Settling now, at last, into something built to last considerably longer than the desert storm that had first brought them together. That winter, the first snow fell lightly over the ranch, dusting the rebuilt barn roof, settling over fields that had once been nothing but cracked earth and dying hope. Silas stood on the porch watching it come down, a pony's hand in his, Winona somewhere inside, teaching herself to read, from a worn book Chogan had brought on his last visit, sounding out English words slowly, patiently, the way she'd once sounded out gratitude to a stranger in a language not her own. Cold enough for you, Silas asked, glancing sideways at a pony, who had wrapped herself in one of Eleanor's old shawls, taken from the chest months earlier with something like permission. Neither of them had needed to speak aloud. I have survived worse than snow, a pony said, though she leaned into him regardless, accepting the warmth he offered without needing to ask for it. Deserts. poison, a man who mistook cruelty for love. Snow, I think, I can manage. Reckon you can manage most things, Silas said. Seen enough proof of that by now, they stood together a while longer, watching the season change around them, watching a ranch that had nearly died breathe steadily onward into whatever came next. Years later, when neighboring children asked about the old, gentle horse still grazing peacefully in the corral, older now, silver-muzzled but still standing proud despite his age, Silas would tell them a story about a dying animal who found reason to live again, about two sisters who crossed an impossible desert, carrying nothing but desperate hope, about a debt years old, finally settled by an act of courage that echoed courage shown long before, about a ranch that nearly died from drought and prejudice both, saved instead by a single choice to see strangers not as danger, but as people equally deserving of kindness. Is it a true story? The children would sometimes ask, and Silas would smile, looking toward a pony working in the garden nearby, toward Winona's own children, playing in fields that had once been barren dust, toward a life built entirely from the ashes of near-total loss. True as anything I've ever known, he'd answer. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that actually happened, exactly the way memory insists on telling them.